You stand before a silence that predates all memory. A silence so complete that even the wind seems uncertain if it should breathe. Beneath your fingers, the texture of baked clay cracked, warm, unassuming. It is not gold, nor marble, nor the polished relics of later kings. It is humble earth pressed by human hands 5,000 years ago. Yet inside it hides a claim that stretches 241,200 years into the past. History, the clay whispers, did not begin where your textbooks start. It began when rulers walked among the gods, when kingship itself was said to have descended from heaven. The light falls low over the imagined plains of Sumer. The horizon gleams like molten copper, a world half-born between river and desert. You can almost hear it, the hiss of reeds, the slow pulse of the Tigris and Euphrates winding like veins through a newborn civilization. Somewhere in that breath of time, someone took a reed stylus and pressed it into wet clay one wedge at a time, deliberate, confident. Each mark carried the rhythm of order, names, numbers, cities, not poetry, not legend, a record. And yet, what record speaks of kings who ruled for 40,000 years, of reigns that outlive empires, epochs, even continents? The voice from the clay does not explain, it simply lists. 8 rulers before the flood, each reigning longer than all recorded history combined. Then one short line that ends it all. Then the flood swept over. That phrase hums like a mantra at the threshold of understanding. The flood, perhaps literal, perhaps cosmic, perhaps something that moved, not only water, but the pattern of time itself. Scholars read it as myth, yet the clay does not tremble with invention. It feels steady, bureaucratic, as though the scribe believed every word. Imagine holding that small prism, its edges dulled by centuries of dust. The symbols are not drawn to astonish. They are the handwriting of a countenance. Still, between the lines, a strange pulse endures a sense that you are not merely reading history, but eavesdropping on eternity. The idea is simple, yet devastating. That rulership, civilization, the very notion of time's measure, was not born from human struggle, but bestowed, delivered. The first city was not built, it descended. You picture Eridu at dawn. Marsh light ripples across shallow pools. The air smells of salt and clay. A fisherman pulls his net as a priest traces a spiral into the mud. And above them, unseen but felt, hangs the conviction that power is a thing that falls not rises. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu, 8 words that invert all we assume about history. But perhaps what unsettles you most is not the strangeness of the claim, but its precision. Each king's name is paired with an exact count of years. Not thousands rounded for grandeur, but numbers ending in 0s and 8s. All divisible by a single constant. The Sar, a Sumerian measure of 3,600 years. The logic is mathematical, not mystical. The tablet speaks with the voice of a ledger, yet the story it tells transcends all ledgers. You look closer. The clay has darkened around the edges, as though scorched by centuries of hands that tried to understand it. Each symbol is both a word and a breath. Between them lies the unspoken question: were these kings human at all, or were they like the gods they served, creatures of longer rhythm, their lives ticking to a cosmic clock we no longer hear? The world around you fades. You feel yourself sink through layers of soil, through centuries of forgotten worship. Each stratum glows faintly: bronze, stone, clay, ash. The deeper you go, the more the air thickens with memory. You reach a level where architecture blurs into geometry, temples aligned with stars that no longer rise in the same place. And there, within that hush, the clay begins to hum. It is the sound of chronology bending. You sense not one history, but two. The first, the world you know. Kings measured in decades, empires that crumble within a lifetime. The second, a vast procession of reigns that stretch beyond comprehension, where one lifetime could witness the rise and fall of entire climates. Between them stands that single sentence, etched into clay and sealed by fire. Then the flood swept over. Perhaps it was water. Perhaps it was something else, a metaphor for an extinction of memory, a deliberate resetting of the world. What matters is the divide it creates. Before it, beings of impossible longevity. After it, the flicker of human time. You linger there, at the lip of that flood. The air smells of dust and rain. Behind you lies everything you have been taught. Before you, a corridor of kings whose years melt into myth, and the clay prism waits, patient, indifferent to belief. It does not demand that you accept. It only invites you to listen. The first line remains, when kingship descended from heaven. It feels less like a statement and more like a threshold one you have just crossed. In the dim light of a museum storeroom, the prism sits behind glass, no taller than your hand. It is plain, clay-colored, its surface etched on four sides with tidy columns of cuneiform. Scholars call it the Weld-Blundell Prism, after the man who funded its discovery a century ago. To most who pass, it looks like a brick fallen from a forgotten wall. But to those who can read its wedge-shaped script, it speaks the oldest list in human memory. Not a poem, not a myth, but a ledger of kings. Close your eyes, and you are back in Nippur, southern Mesopotamia, early 1900s. Dust swirls around a team of archaeologists kneeling among sun-baked ruins. The ground is dry and brittle, the air humming with flies. Beneath their brushes lie broken jars, bits of pottery, fragments of tablets. Each stroke of the brush is both discovery and resurrection. Then, from a mound near a crumbled temple, a prism of clay emerges small, four-sided, inscribed on every face. It is lifted from the dust like a sleeping heart. No one yet knows what it says, but when cleaned and studied, it reveals a lineage of rulers stretching back into shadow. It names cities that can still be traced beneath the soil: Eridu, Batibira, Larak, Sippur. It lists kings whose reigns last not centuries, but tens of millennia. And at the end, a single, quiet statement. Then the flood swept over. The writing is precise, impersonal. There is no decoration, no plea to the gods, just columns of numbers, signs, measures. It reads like bureaucracy, but breathes like scripture. You imagine the scribe at his table in 2100 BCE, dipping his reed stylus, pressing each line with the calm certainty of someone recording taxes. Yet his ink is clay, his ledger eternity. He is not writing for his king. He is writing for time. The prism is a paradox. It looks administrative, but it undermines history. Its tone is sober, but its content impossible. It anchors myth to math. In its four neat faces, you see an ancient mind trying to make sense of time so vast that even myth could not contain it. The Sumerians were not romantic dreamers. They were accountants of the cosmos. Think of the world that produced this artifact. Sumer, land of reeds and rivers, where the horizon trembles like heat over water. Cities rise like mirages Uruk, by the marshes Uruk, by the steppe. Nippur, at the navel of heaven and earth. Temples are stacked like mountains, brick upon brick, echoing the order of the sky. Priests observe stars as officials record grain. To them, the act of writing is worship. To mark the world is to preserve divine order. Now, inside that order, a document like this appears. It dares to quantify the unthinkable. The first king, Ululam, rules for 28,800 years. The prism was baked hard to last, and it did. Through empire and ruin, through centuries when even its language was forgotten, it endured. When it was finally unearthed, its letters still carried a sheen of glaze from the fire that once sealed them. Fire that preserved memory. Fire that turned mud into message. You picture it lying beneath the ground, surrounded by shards of other tablets' letters, receipts, hymns, all silent. But this one glows faintly in the dark, because it contains more than data. It contains a worldview that history began when heaven touched earth, when authority descended like light, and that everything since has been echo. Hold the image, for sides, for directions, for ages. The prism is not merely an object, it is a miniature cosmos. On each face, the words march downward like rivers of time. At the corners, the edges meet heaven and earth joined in baked clay. The Sumerians believed that what is written endures, not just in memory, but in being. To record something was to keep it alive. So long as the signs remain, the kings remain. That is why the prism matters. It is not evidence of gods or men. It is evidence of belief itself, the conviction that order descends, that numbers mirror the heavens, that time can be captured and made to sing. Centuries later, in a sterile museum room, you stand before it again. Your reflection blurs on the glass, ghosted over the ancient script. Behind you, the world hums with electric light, not torchlight. And still, the prism keeps its own glow, soft and patient. Its message has not changed. It says, kingship began elsewhere. It came down, it measured the earth, and then the waters rose. And as you watch, it almost seems to breathe. The clay exhales a faint warmth, the warmth of hands that believed writing could bridge the mortal and the divine. A document so small, yet heavy enough to bend the weight of history. Somewhere deep within that clay, perhaps between two signs that mean king and year, there is an older word, one that no scholar has yet translated, a word that simply means beginning. The prism speaks in numbers. It does not embellish, it counts. And yet its arithmetic opens a chasm wider than myth. 8 kings, 8 reigns, 8 measures of time that defy mortality. Each number seems chosen with a craftsman, Isakaram, 28,836,000. You trace the columns with your eyes. There is rhythm here. Every reign forms a stanza in an equation too vast for modern sense. Ululam, 8, Sars, Alalga, 10, Enmenluana, 12. The sequence ascends as though climbing a staircase invisible to us now. Each step measured in cosmic units, each king a beat in the pulse of creation. Then the flood reset to 0. Modern scholars call these spans impossible, products of mythic imagination. But the tablet's precision argues otherwise. Myth exaggerates, but bureaucracy accounts. The scribe did not round numbers for poetry. He recorded them with the same discipline he might list the bushels of grain collected at harvest. That is what unsettles. This document believes itself. It does not try to convince. It simply presents. Imagine a priest astronomer standing on a ziggurat beneath a sky unpolluted by smoke or cities. Above him, the constellations wheel in silence. He measures time by stars, not by hours. He sees the heavens turn through cycles longer than a human life, perhaps through several. And he marks their completion in Sa's 3,600-year breaths of the cosmos. In such a world, a reign of 12 Sars would not sound absurd. It would sound symmetrical. Perhaps the list does not record lifetimes, but alignments. Each king a marker for a celestial phase, each reign the duration of a great rhythm between heaven and earth. When that rhythm broke, when the flood swept over it, was not just water that shifted, but the geometry of the sky. Still, you feel the human undercurrent in these impossible numbers. The desire to measure, to hold the infinite in the palm of arithmetic. Civilization begins there. The attempt to make eternity legible, to convert awe into order, to count the uncountable. But what if the Sumerians were not only measuring? What if they were remembering? What if these vast spans were echoes of something real, a biological or cosmic inheritance now lost? In ancient texts from Egypt, from India, from the Hebrew scrolls, the pattern repeats: mortal reigns before a flood, shorter lives after. Could these be independent inventions, or scattered fragments of one ancient memory? There is a term in Sumerian thought, Mitha divine decrees, the laws that shape reality itself. Among them is the law of number. To alter a number was to alter the order of the world. Perhaps the King List was a recitation of those laws, a mathematical prayer meant to keep creation stable. You picture the scribe again, leaning over wet clay. His hand moves with ritual precision. The wedge impressions are tiny, but the gesture is monumental. He is keeping the cosmos in balance. Each line an offering to the gods of order, each figure a chord in a cosmic symphony. And then, at the end, the silence of the floodden, abrupt pause, a rest in the music of history. What if that silence still vibrates beneath us? The earth, after all, keeps time in its own way. Magnetic reversals, orbital cycles. The slow tilt of its axis all follow patterns, not unlike the Tsar. The ancients may not have had telescopes, but they watched the heavens with a devotion modern instruments cannot replicate. They saw connections we have forgotten how to see. You look again at the numbers carved into clay. They do not read like superstition. They read like coordinates. Perhaps each reign marks a period of contact. A visitation of those the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, the shining ones who came from the sky. To them, a single cycle of 3,600 years might have been a heartbeat. To us, it is an age. The scale of their time dwarfed ours, as the prism's numbers dwarf our history. Between myth and math lies a thin veil. The Sumerian King List occupies that veil, bridging imagination and measurement. It tempts both skeptic and believer. For every scholar who calls it symbolic, another finds too much precision to dismiss. If it were mere allegory, why align each reign to an exact multiple of the Tsar? Why such discipline in a document otherwise untouched by metaphor? And so you arrive at the paradox that hums beneath all ancient memory. Either these numbers are meaningless, or they are the most meaningful thing we have ever ignored. The clay does not care which you choose. It continues to exist, untroubled by belief, repeating the same quiet mantra for 5 millennia. The kings ruled for 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. It is both absurd and holy. A statement so calm, it destabilizes everything that came after. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians baked their words into stone, to remind the future that knowledge is never entirely lost, only waiting for the right question to awaken it. And now, standing before that prism, you begin to feel what they might have felt, the strange, dizzying comfort of numbers that stretch beyond comprehension. A reassurance that somewhere, above or below, there is still an order we have yet to measure. The numbers do not live alone. They shimmer through every civilization like a reflection caught in still water. Across continents, Across languages, the same rhythm repeats an age before, an age after, a flood between. The Sumerians may have pressed it first into clay, but the echo rolls outward until it touches nearly every story humanity has ever told about itself. In Egypt, the king lists etched on temple walls speak of pharaohs who reigned not for decades, but for thousands of years. In India, the Satya Yuga unfolds over ages so immense that the mind folds under their weight. In the Hebrew scriptures, Adam lives 930 years, Noah 950, Methuselah nearly 1,000. Then the flood comes, and lifespans collapse like reeds underwater. Afterward, men live shorter, thinner lives. In China, the early sovereigns are said to rule for centuries until heaven withdraws its mandate. Everywhere the same melody, transposed into different tongues. This is the mirror the Sumerian King List holds up to the world. It reflects not one culture, but a pattern that seems too widespread to be coincidence. A collective memory, perhaps, of a time when the distance between human and divine was smaller, when time flowed more slowly, or when those who ruled were not entirely human. The stories differ in detail, but share a grammar of awe. Long reigns, sacred descent, cataclysmic reset. In each, the flood is not just punishment, but transition, a hinge between worlds. It marks the point where eternity bends toward mortality. Before it, rulers stand tall as constellations. After it, men count their days by the sun. Why does the flood appear everywhere? Because water remembers. It carries the sediments of every age, holding within its motion the weight of all that drowned. The ancients may have lived through regional floods, but the memory of one overwhelming deluge, real or symbolic, became the universal boundary of time. It is both geological and spiritual, a scar in the strata of the earth and in the soul. And within that scar, each culture placed its kings. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, the Egyptians their Neteru, the Hebrews their Nephilim, the Greeks their Titans. Always the same shape, beings older, taller, brighter, whose rule ended in disaster and silence. Civilizations separated by oceans still told of gods walking among men, teaching them to write, to measure, to build, and then vanishing. Imagine the pattern as a constellation seen from different hemispheres. Each culture connects the stars in its own way, names them differently, but the lights are the same. The King List is one corner of that constellation. The Bible, the Vedas, the pyramid texts other corners. Together they sketch the silhouette of an age that might once have been real. Perhaps what binds them is not literal memory, but archetype, the way the human mind repeats itself across generations. We dream of beginnings touched by the divine because our own beginnings are a mystery we cannot solve. The ancients externalized that mystery as gods who descended, kings who ruled too long, and floods that washed away what was never meant to last. Yet there is a strange precision beneath the poetry. The Sumerians measure in sars, the Hindus in yugas, the Egyptians in cycles of Zeptepi, the first time. Each describes time as circular, not linear. History repeats in vast spirals, each age shorter, more fragile than the last. Modern science, for all its skepticism, echoes the same shape. Civilizations rise, collapse, and rise again. Climates warm and cool. Species bloom and vanish. Even stars pulse in cycles of birth and decay. Maybe that is why these stories comfort even as they unsettle. They tell us the world has died before and will die again, but also that death is not final. The flood sweeps over, and still life returns. The clay dries, and someone writes anew. Kingship descends, vanishes, and descends again. The pattern itself is the message. You stand before the prism and its impossible numbers, but now you see them differently. They are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a larger chorus. The same rhythm beats beneath pyramids, beneath Vedic hymns, beneath the ark resting on Ararat. You realize that the Sumerian tablet is less a record than a mirror angled toward the cosmos. Through it, you glimpse the collective dream of humanity, a longing to remember a time when heaven was near enough to touch. And so the prism is not merely an artifact of Sumer. It is a fragment of the world's own memory, the clay embodiment of a story told again and again. That civilization began not with us, but with them, whoever they were. Beings of light, of vast years, whose presence bent the flow of time. The flood washed them away, but the reflection remains. Each culture keeps a shard of it, polished by its own language. The Sumerians pressed theirs into earth. The Hebrews carved theirs into faith. The Indians sang theirs into eternity. And you, centuries later, find yourself caught in the same reflection, staring into the same question. If all of them remember the same thing, what exactly did they see? You pictured the dawn, the first city rising from marsh and salt wind, Eridu. The word itself sounds like a breath drawn through reeds, half air, half water. This is where the Sumerian King List begins its chant. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. Not was founded, not was built, but descended, like light falling upon a mirror. The implication is subtle, yet seismic. Civilization did not emerge derived. The sun lifts above the Persian Gulf. In the distance, the land trembles with the shimmer of heat. You see the first outlines of mud brick walls, low and uneven. Smoke curls from a shrine by the water. Around it, huts cluster like shells at the edge of a tide. Somewhere among them, a priest scratches signs into wet clay, and thus begins the long experiment of history. Archaeologists, sifting through Eridu's layers, find a pattern unlike the slow growth of a village. The city appears already organized, temples carefully aligned to the stars, foundations rebuilt again and again upon the same axis. There is no visible struggle from chaos to order. It begins ordered, as though the plan was delivered whole. One layer reveals an altar blackened by fire. Another, a platform perfectly squared to the north. Each rebuild seems a renewal of something ancient, not a fresh invention. In their myths, the Sumerians called Eridu the seat of wisdom, the dwelling of Enkidu, god of water, of knowledge, of creation's hidden mechanisms. To dwell here was to live in the shadow of the divine. To rule here was to bear the weight of heaven's decree. Thus, Ululam, the first king, was not elected nor born to power. He was chosen by descent. His authority carried on the same wind that rippled the marshes. Picture him not as a conqueror, but as a still point around which time revolved. His reign, the tablet says, lasted 28,800 years, 8 full sars. During that span, empires could have risen and turned to dust. Glaciers might have come and gone. To human reckoning, he would seem eternal. To the Sumerians, he was proof that kingship was not a human institution at all, but a covenant between earth and sky. What does it mean for kingship to descend? The word carries weight. It suggests a vertical transfer knowledge or order falling from above to below. In every later civilization, the echo remains. The Egyptian pharaoh receives the breath of Ra. The Chinese emperor rules by the mandate of heaven. The Hebrew prophets speak of anointing, the descent of spirit upon chosen men. Each is a linguistic descendant of Eridu's idea. Authority is not built, is bestowed. The Temple of Enki, excavated from Eridu's sands, shows this belief in brick. Its foundations are oriented as if to mirror the constellations. The stairway that leads to its altar curves like the Milky Way. The architects were not simply building, they were imitating the structure of the heavens, grounding divine geometry into earth. The act of construction was itself worship, an imitation of the God's own creation. You can almost smell the air of that time, brine, ash, and reed smoke. The priests pour water over the altar, chanting in a language older than sound itself. Around them, the first city breathes boats, moving through canals. Fish drying in the sun, children playing beside walls that will one day crumble into myth. In this quiet order, kingship begins not as power, but as duty. To rule was to maintain the balance between the tides and the stars. And somewhere within this equilibrium, Ululam reigns not as a man, but as an axis. Generations live and die under his gaze. They build, they harvest, they bury, while he remains the steady measure of their world. What happens to the mind of a people when their king never dies? Does time itself lose meaning? Does reverence turn into dependence? In the eternal reign of one figure, mortality finds both comfort and imprisonment. The King List records nothing of Ululam's deeds, no wars, no edicts, no triumphs, only his name, his city, his years. As though the simple fact of his existence was act enough. He embodies the principle of kingship, not its narrative. His silence is the point. Perfection does not need biography. The scribe who pressed those signs into clay did not doubt. To him, 28,800 years was not exaggeration, was symmetry, 8 sars. The number of balance, 8. The octave that completes a cycle before starting anew. To write that number was to affirm that the first ruler matched the rhythm of the cosmos. You wonder what it meant to live in that first city, beneath the first king. Perhaps people did not speak of time at all. Perhaps they measured their lives by the rising of the marsh birds or the color of the water at dusk. Perhaps they believed the world would remain as it was forever. Water feeding earth, earth feeding fire, fire feeding sky. And when the king's eyes grew dim, perhaps another light ignited in their place. Unbroken, seamless, as if the man were only a mask worn by eternity itself. In later ages, poets would call Eridu the city that touched heaven. But it was also the first city to be buried by sand. Time layered over it as it had once layered through it. What remains today is foundation, outline, dust. Yet beneath that dust, the pattern persists. Each civilization that came after repeated Eridu in miniature, building its own axis between the seen and the unseen. And so, as you stand on that vanished ground in imagination, the phrase returns with its quiet authority, when kingship descended from heaven. It was in Eridu. You hear it now not as myth, but as the memory of a beginning. A declaration that somewhere between heaven's light and earth's clay, humanity first learned to build in imitation of the divine. The first city was never only a place. It was a conversation, a descent that has not yet finished falling. The clay tablet continues quiet, exact after Ululam. Kingship descended again to Alalga, who ruled for 36,000 years, 10 full sars. The number feels deliberate, like the completion of a circle. If Ululam was the spark, Alalga is the flame that takes shape. In his reign, kingship ceases to be a miracle and becomes a structure. The chaos of divine arrival settles into ritual. You see him now, Alagar, sitting beneath the shimmer of oil lamps, the walls of his court breathing with heat. The reeds sway outside, but inside, The air is still thick with incense, heavy with memory. His face is calm, unhurried, as though centuries pass with each blink. He speaks rarely. When he does, his words are measured, slow, as if time itself waits for him to finish. To his people, he is not just a king, he is continuity made flesh. Eridu under Alalga grows. Temples widen, their corners squared to the stars. Canals deepen, joining rivers like arteries of clay. The artisans of his era learn the rhythm of permanence. Walls are rebuilt on top of older walls, each new layer mirroring the one beneath. The Sumerians call this building upon the me, renewing the divine pattern. Every act of construction becomes a reaffirmation that kingship still flows from the heavens, unbroken. Archaeologists who dig through these layers notice the repetition. Temple upon temple, altar upon altar. They call it stratigraphy. The ancients might have called it faith. For each generation, to rebuild was not an act of progress, but of preservation, proof that what descended still remained. In mythic hindsight, Alalgar's reign feels quiet. No wars are recorded, no conquests sung. Yet that silence hums with stability. A reign that lasted 10 Sars, because it understood rhythm better than motion. Under him, kingship became less about dominion and more about harmony, the maintenance of cosmic law through ceremony. He built no monuments to his name, because the city itself was his monument, endlessly renewed. Picture the priests walking in procession through Eridu's courtyards. They carry water from the canal in jars of red clay, pouring it over the temple steps as they chant hymns to Enki, god of wisdom and deep waters. The king watches from the threshold. The sun catches the surface of the water as it spills downward, and for a moment, the line between heaven and earth blurs. This is how authority looked, not as domination, but as alignment. Perhaps this is why later civilizations remembered their best rulers as still ones, the pharaoh seated in eternal posture, the Chinese sage king meditating between mountains, the Hebrew Solomon whose wisdom held the city in quiet order. Each of them, in their own age, echoes Alalga, the keeper rather than the conqueror. The King List gives only numbers, but within those numbers lies philosophy. 10 Sars, 10 cycles of perfection. To the Sumerian mind, 10 symbolize completeness, the return to unity. Alalga's rule was the mathematical proof that kingship, once descended, could endure without interruption. If Alalga was the descent of light, Alalga was the setting of its foundation. He turned the act of ruling into an art of balance. Yet beneath the stillness, a question stirs. How long can order last before it petrifies? What happens when the divine rhythm slows to a hum so constant that people forget it once began? The King List does not say. It only marks the end of Alalga's 36,000 years and moves on, as if to suggest that even the eternal must eventually yield to change. Imagine being born in the 1000th year of his reign. Your grandparents' grandparents told stories of the same king sitting on the same throne. They died believing he would outlive the sun. And indeed, he did for them, for their children, for generations uncounted. The rhythm of life itself began to orbit around his endurance. Perhaps by the end, the people no longer remembered his beginning. He was simply there, like the river or the stars. In that longevity lies both comfort and sorrow. The comfort of knowing that order endures. The sorrow of realizing that time has lost its texture. Under an immortal ruler, change becomes heresy. The world freezes in the perfection of its first pattern. And yet, even that stillness is fragile, waiting for the next descent, the next transformation. When Alalga's reign finally closes, the tablet says only, Then kingship was taken to Bad-Tibira. Taken, not seized, not lost, transferred as one passes a sacred flame. In that single verb lies the Sumerian vision of time, not destruction, but movement, a relay of divinity from one city to another. The kingdom itself is the traveler. The kings are merely its resting places. And so, as Alalga fades into the symmetry of his years, you sense the world shifting again. The luster of Eridu dims, its marshes still glittering but quieter now, as though holding their breath. Beyond the horizon, a new city stirs, the city of the forge. Their smoke will rise not from offerings but from furnaces. Fire will replace water as the divine element. The next king will not be a keeper of balance, but a shaper of matter. Still, the pattern remains. What descends will descend again. Kingship does not die, it migrates, carrying the memory of its first light. And somewhere in the ruins of Eridu, where layers of temples sleep beneath sand, the echo of Alalga's silence remains the silence of a ruler who turned eternity into architecture. The prism turns, and the clay breathes another line. Then kingship was taken to Bad-Tibira. In Bad-Tibira, Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. 12 stars, the number of completion of a full circle around the heavens. After Eridu's marshes and temples of water, the world enters a new element, fire. The city of the forge, Bad-Tibira, where metal met sky and the scent of molten earth filled the air. You see it now, the horizon burning copper at dawn, smoke trailing like slow-moving constellations. The sound of hammers drifts across the plains, steady as heartbeat. This is not the gentle kingdom of Alalga. It is louder, brighter, filled with motion. The people here shape what once shaped them. Stone and ore are pulled from the ground, melted, reborn as tools, as weapons, as ornaments, gleaming like starlight. To create becomes a form of invocation. Enmenluana stands at the edge of a great furnace, his face silvered by heat. He is tall, robed in threads of bronze light, his eyes reflecting both flame and reflection. Around him, workers chant to the rhythm of their anvils, each strike echoing a syllable of the old prayer. May the order of heaven be fixed upon the earth. The sparks leap upward like tiny suns, and for a moment, it is impossible to tell if the forge imitates the stars, or if the stars imitate the forge. Archaeologists uncover slag heaps and blackened clay molds in the ruins of Bad-Tibira, signs of early metalwork, perhaps the first on Earth. They find not merely remnants of labor, but symbols etched into crucibles, spirals, circles, a pattern that mirrors the night sky above the city. To the people of that age, metallurgy was no craft. It was alchemy, the divine act of transforming what is hidden into what can shine. In this place, knowledge is heat. Wisdom burns. Enmenluana is remembered not as a warrior, but as a bringer of transformation. He reigns through the mastery of elements, teaching the balance between destruction and creation. Under him, kingship takes a new shape. It becomes technological, experimental. The divine descent turns into invention. Humanity, under divine supervision, learns to control the same fire that once belonged only to heaven. You can almost hear the song of that city, rhythmic, industrial, before the word existed. Metal clanging, wind whistling through furnaces, chants weaving through smoke. The night sky above glows red with reflected embers, constellations fading behind the shimmer of man-made light. The boundary between heaven and earth blurs again, but differently this time. It is no longer a descent. It is a mirror rising upward. Some later myths speak of gods who came down to teach men the art of the forged Tubal-Cain in Hebrew tradition, Ptah in Egypt, Hephaestus in Greece. Always the same figure, half-divine smith, bearer of the cosmic flame. In the King List, Enmenluana is that archetype, long before his name fragments into many each. Hammerstrike in Bad Tabira is a syllable in that ancient language of creation, the sound of divinity turning raw earth into ordered form. And yet, every act of creation carries its shadow. Fire that shapes also consumes. Perhaps those who ruled here understood the danger too well. For to command the forge is to walk the edge between mastery and ruin. The King List says, Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years a span. That feels less like time than like temperature. Maybe it marks how long the flame of divine craft could burn before it needed rest. You step closer in imagination. The air of Bad Tabira is thick with metal and prayer. Children trace patterns in the soot, while priests chart the stars above, searching for omens in their movement. The city lives by two fires, one in the sky, one in the furnace. And in the center stands the king, intermediary between both. Perhaps this was when humanity began to see creation as imitation rather than revelation, to forge rather than receive. Each blade, each ornament, each brick of tempered clay whispers, "We can do as the gods did." It is a bold whisper, almost defiant. In that murmur lies both progress and hubris, the seed of all future empires. When Enmenluana's reign finally cools, the King List moves again. Then kingship was taken to Larak. The fire dims, the furnaces fade into ash, but the idea persists. The knowledge of transformation cannot be unlearned. From now on, every civilization will remember how to call down lightning and trap it in metal. You imagine the last night of Bad Tabira. The air is quiet, heavy with the scent of rain and rust. The forges go dark one by one, their embers winking out like stars returning to the sky. A priest seals the final tablet, murmuring the words that have followed every transfer of kingship. The order moves onward. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another city waits, dreaming beneath its own constellation. The line between heaven and earth remains, glowing faintly drawn not in water this time, nor in fire, but in memory. The prism breathes another line of clay. Then kingship was taken to Larak. In Larak, Antediluvian ruled for 28,800 years. The words are simple, yet their silence is vast. No hymns, no stories, no monuments, only a name, a number, a city that no archaeologist has ever found. Larak is a ghost between epochs, an echo in the dust of Mesopotamia. You close your eyes and try to imagine it. A city half remembered, half erased, where the river curves like a question mark. Perhaps its bricks still sleep beneath the silt of an unknown plain. Or perhaps it was never of clay at all. Perhaps Larak existed in the mind, a pattern of order rather than a place of stone. The Sumerians spoke often of 5 cities before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar. Of the 5, Larak alone remains hidden, as if it was built not for discovery but for remembrance. The tablet offers no guidance. It records only in Sipajadanas, Renet, Sars, the same cosmic measure as Alulam's. In that symmetry there is intent, a return to the rhythm of beginnings. If Bad Tabira was the forge, Larak is the pause that cools the metal. After the heat of transformation, the world needs balance again, the stillness of judgment. The few fragments that whisper of Larak, connected with the god Nenator of law, of healing, of measured war. His emblem was the plow and the lightning bolt, tools of both cultivation and destruction. To reign under Ninurta's gaze was to maintain equilibrium, to weigh justice as carefully as grain. Perhaps that is why the King List gives Ensepa-Jadana no mythic deeds. His task was not to build or conquer, but to preserve the balance between chaos and form. Imagine a city ruled by such silence. Streets laid out with geometric precision, every house aligned to the same invisible axis. Priests marking days with strings of beads, each prayer a small correction to the universe's tilt. The air would hum with ritual, not noise. At dusk, the citizens light lamps in the same order each evening, each flame answering another, until the whole city glows like a constellation upon the earth. In your mind's eye, Larak becomes less a city than a mirror reflecting the pattern of heaven onto the soil. Its laws are the stars, its king the balance point between them. Generations come and go, yet the rhythm never changes. Ensepa-Jadana sits upon his throne, unaging as the world outside shifts and forgets. He is the custodian of symmetry, the unseen guardian of a design older than dust. And yet, the city vanishes. No ruins, no tablets, no shards. Scholars propose a dozen sites, all uncertain. Some say floods erased it. Others believe it was an idea carried into later cities, memory of perfection too fragile for the world. There is a haunting beauty in that absence. Larak is the city that refuses to be found, as if the gods took it back. From the mythic view, this disappearance carries meaning. The cities before the flood trace a pattern: water, fire, law, sky, survival. Each one a step in the cosmic descent of kingship. Eridu, the source; Bad-Tibira, the transformation; Larak, the judgment; and beyond, Sipa, the ascent. The sequence feels less like geography than initiation, a progression of divine elements shaping the mortal world. If Larak's essence was balance, its loss marks a turning point. Without it, creation leans forward, toward imbalance, toward the flood. Perhaps the silence of Ensepa-Jadana's reign is the silence before correction, the calm before a cosmic verdict. When later scribes pressed his name into clay, maybe they understood that absence itself is a message that not everything meant to endure should be visible. You can almost hear the final night of Larak, the air still, the lamps burning low, the king sitting in meditation as the stars wheel above him. No armies approach, no disasters roar, only a gradual fading, as though the city exhales and dissolves back into the horizon. The next dawn, the plains are empty. The river runs quietly through reeds, erasing its course. Where the streets once were, fish now swim. And yet, the idea of Larak survives. Every civilization builds its own version, a place of hidden order, a perfect city glimpsed but never reached. Plato's Atlantis, Enoch's heavenly Jerusalem, the mandala of Shambhala. Each one is Larak reborn, a city that exists just beyond evidence, suspended between memory and faith. Ensepa-Jadana's 28,800 years become a symbol of constancy amid impermanence, a reminder that not all legacies leave ruins. Some endure as balance itself, as the invisible law that keeps rivers flowing and stars aligned. The Sumerians may have lost the map to Larak, but they preserved its geometry in every ziggurat they built thereafter. So, when the King List moves again, then kingship was taken to Sipa. It does so through silence. The clay does not mourn Larak, it simply turns the page. In that quiet transition lies the essence of the list's mystery. Each city, each king, is a verse in the same hymn sung across millennia. And somewhere, perhaps beneath a nameless hill or buried under the waters of the Euphrates, the dust of Larak still waits. the city that no one found, because it was never meant to be found, only remembered. The clay prism turns again, its wedge marks steady as heartbeat. Then kingship was taken to Sippar. In Sippar, Enmendarana ruled for 21,000 years, fewer than those before him, yet his story burns brighter. For Enmendarana is not remembered as one who died, but as one who was taken up. The Sumerians wrote of him with quiet awe, the king who did not descend into the underworld, but ascended to the heavens, the man who bridged sky and clay. You see Sippar as the day begins, a city of light. The sun rises over ziggurats, built like stepped mirrors, their faces catching the first fire of dawn. The priests lift their hands toward the east, murmuring hymns to Shamash, the sun god, patron of justice and illumination. The light falls in long beams across the courtyards, tracing patterns of order. Here, everything is measured by radiance, time, morality, power. To reign in Sippar is to reign in daylight, where nothing can hide. Enmendarana walks through this brilliance, clothed in white linen, his eyes reflecting gold. He is said to commune directly with the gods, not through sacrifice or smoke, but through vision. In the oldest tablets, he is granted the arts of divination, the reading of oil upon water, the tracing of stars, the calculus of heaven's will. To him, knowledge is not granted once, but received continuously, a stream descending from sky to mind. The myth surrounding him hums with strange familiarity. In later ages, the Hebrews would speak of Enoch, who walked with God and was not, for God took him. In Babylon, scholars would write of a king lifted to the heavens and taught the secrets of the sun. Across time and language, the same figure appears, mortal yet chosen, interpreter between earth and the divine. The King List names him plainly, but the myths turn him into a singular ascent of understanding itself. Archaeologists identify Sippar as one of the oldest centers of astronomy. Fragments of star lists, records of eclipses, and calendars written in cuneiform have been found among its ruins. It was here, perhaps, that humanity first measured the sky not as a myth, but as a system. Imagine the temple roof at night, a flat expanse open to the stars, priests laying strings across the constellations, turning light into law. Each observation a prayer written in geometry. The reign of Enmendarana, said to last 21,000 years, nearly 6 Sazrids, less like a lifetime and more like a cycle of revelation. In those endless years, the king becomes the embodiment of a question. How close can a mortal stand to the divine before vanishing into it? Perhaps that is why his story ends not with death but with light. He was taken into heaven. The clay offers no detail, no struggle. It is as if ascension was as natural as breath. You imagine the moment. The city glows under the noon sun. The king stands atop the highest terrace of Sippar's temple, arms raised in silent invocation. Around him, the air shimmers, the light thickens, and sound falls away. To the onlookers below, he becomes a silhouette dissolving into gold. Later, they will say the gods called him home, or that he learned to ride the path of the sun itself. For those who remained, his absence was not lost, was confirmation that the link between heaven and earth was real. In the symbolic order of the King List, Sippar represents illumination, the union of divine knowledge and human reason. If Larak was balance, Sippar is revelation. Here, kingship ceases to be about governing cities. It becomes about translating heaven's pattern. The king is no longer merely ruler. He is messenger. Through him, the people learn the rhythm of seasons, the justice of light, the mathematics of stars. But light, like all gifts, has a cost. The more it reveals, the more it exposes. To live in a city of the sun is to have no shadows in which to hide. Every flaw, every error becomes visible. Perhaps this is why Sippa's reign, though bright, is shorter than the cities before. Illumination cannot last forever without consuming itself. The King List moves on, as always, with the same calm inevitability. Then kingship was taken to Shuruppak, and so the light begins to fade. The beams of the sun turn red, then gold, then dim. The temples of Sippa gleam one last time before being swallowed by dusk. But its influence endures. Every culture that looked up at the sky inherited something of Sippa, their idea that the heavens could be read, that light itself could teach. The Egyptian priests at Heliopolis, the Greek philosophers at Delphi, the scholars of medieval Baghdad, in their own way, are children of that city of the sun. For now, the story pauses at twilight. The world, once bright with divine knowledge, begins to tremble with a different kind of revelation. Beyond Sippa lies the last city of the age before the flood. Its king will not ascend, but await catastrophe. The waters are gathering. The rhythm of the stars has nearly completed its circle. As the prism's next line waits to be read, the wind carries the echo of Sippa's light across the plains. It glows still, faint and eternal, a thread of illumination between gods and men. And somewhere within it, Enmanjurana's voice endures calm, distant, reminding us that ascent is not escape, but remembrance. The final line before the deluge reads like a whisper of farewell. Then kingship was taken to Shuruppak. In Shuruppak, Ubara-Tutu ruled for 18,600 years. After him, there are no more reigns of millennia, only water, only silence. The clay tablet pauses here, the breath before the drowning. The last city of the divine order stands poised on the edge of its own erasure. You see it in your mind, Shuruppak shimmering beneath a heavy sky, built on the banks of the Euphrates. The air is thick, heavy with heat and omens. Fishermen drag nets that glisten with silt instead of scales. The priests read portents in the clouds and in the trembling of the reeds. Even the animals seem restless, pacing, listening. Something immense is coming, though no one can name it. The city itself is older than imagination. Archaeologists who dig where Shuruppak once stood find walls swallowed by mud, pottery shattered beneath layers of flood silt. They measured the sediment 2 meters thick and date it to around 2900 BCE, a layer of destruction so sudden that it divides the Earth's memory in half. Above it, the remains of a new civilization. Below it, the shadow of one forgotten. Between them, only water. In the King List, Ubara-Tutu rules through that stillness before collapse. His 18,600 years shorter than the kings before him feel like a contraction, as if time itself is winding down. His reign ends with no story, no myth, only transition. But outside the tablet, another legend grows. The tale of his son, Ziusudra, the one who built the boat, the Sumerian Noah, the survivor. Imagine the night before the flood, the air electric, the stars hidden behind clouds. Ubara-Tutu stands upon the city walls, his robes fluttering in the hot wind. He senses what the priests cannot yet speak aloud. The age of long-lived kings is ending. The covenant between heaven and earth is fraying. From Eridu to Sippa, the divine rhythm has pulsed for 241,200 years. But now the cycle is breaking. The flood will be its punctuation. In the epic of Atrahasis, the gods grow weary of humankind's noise, their endless clamor reaching heaven. They decide to cleanse the earth. In the epic of Gilgamesh, the flood comes as judgment, sparing only one righteous man. And in Genesis, the same story survives. Noah, the ark, the dove, all trace their ancestry to this moment, to Shuruppak and its silent king. The flood, then, is not just destruction, it is a boundary, a deliberate reset. Picture the city as rain begins. The first drops fall thick as stones, then turn into a roar. Streets vanish beneath torrents, temples crack, ziggurats crumble. The great river swells and leaps its banks. People climb onto rooftops, clutching relics, shouting prayers swallowed by thunder. The wind howls like something alive. And somewhere in the chaos, Ziusudra seals the door of his vessel. Ubara-Tutu watches, perhaps knowing that kingship will not survive, only memory. The King List captures none of this. It reduces an age of terror and awe to 6 words. Then the flood swept over, yet in those 6 words lies the hinge of history. Before them, kings reign for tens of thousands of years, their lives measured in the rhythm of the stars. After them, reigns shrank to centuries, then decades. Longevity itself collapses. Time becomes mortal. Why did the scribes make this the dividing line? Because something fundamental changed. In every tradition, after the flood, the gods retreat, the world cools, the veil thickens. The age of direct contact ends. Humanity awakens to its own isolation. The descent of kingship ceases to be literal, it becomes metaphorical. Rulers still claim divine right, but they no longer remember its origin. They inherit a title without the power that once justified it. Some researchers suggest that the flood was no single event, but a memory of many a series of catastrophes passed down through generations. Melting glaciers, collapsing rivers, the sea swallowing fertile plains. Each retelling compresses centuries into a single night of judgment. Yet the emotional truth remains the same. A world washed clean, the divine covenant withdrawn, and the survivors left to rebuild. Standing amid that ruin, the survivors must have looked upon the horizon and seen more than water. They saw the end of eternity. Their fathers had lived for thousands of years. They would live scarcely a century. Their kings had been demigods. Now they were men. What once descended from heaven now had to be built from earth. Civilization, once bestowed, would henceforth have to be earned. In that shift, humanity was born anew, not as subjects of the divine, but as seekers of it. The flood was both punishment and liberation, wiping away the age of immortal kings so that the age of mortal memory could begin. The scribes, who later pressed the King List into clay, did not mourn the old world, they recorded its echo. The flood was not only an ending, it was a calibration of time itself. As the waters recede in your mind's eye, Shuruppak lies silent beneath a film of silt. The ziggurat is gone. The streets are gone. Only the outline of a city remains, like a fossil pressed into the skin of the earth. And beneath it, sealed in clay, the last words of that vanished order. Then the flood swept over. The phrase hangs in the air like a prayer and a warning both. A single sentence that resets the calendar of civilization. Before it, 241,200 years of the gods. After it, the story of us. The words echo, sparse and absolute. Then the flood swept over. The King List breaks its rhythm here as if the stylus itself hesitated. For thousands of years, the tablets had measured rains with precision, but now there is only water. The story dissolves. The clay turns blank. And yet, within that blankness lies the most profound transition in all ancient memory, the end of the divine age, and the slow, trembling birth of humanity as we know it. You can almost hear the silence after the storm. The sky is pale, stripped of color. The waters have receded, leaving behind plains of mud where cities once stood. Broken columns jut like bones through silt. The air smells of clay, of death, of beginnings. In that stillness, the survivors crawl out from their arks, their caves, their high mountains. They look at the horizon and realize the old order is gone. The gods have withdrawn, and the world no longer hums with the same eternal rhythm. Every tradition remembers this silence. In Sumer, the flood ends with Ziusudra offering a sacrifice to the gods, and the gods granting him immortality as a token of gratitude. In Babylon, Utnapishtim receives the same gift. In the Bible, Noah builds an altar, and a rainbow stretches across the sky, a covenant, fragile and colorful, between heaven and earth. Different names, same gesture, a promise that the cycle will not be repeated, at least not yet, but promises fade. The King List resumes, its tone changed. After the flood, rains shrank dramatically from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then to decades. Gilgamesh rules for 126 years, others for less. The ages of impossible lifespans are over. The gods no longer walk among men. They whisper, if they speak at all. It is as though time itself has condensed, the air thicker, the human body smaller, the divine presence dimmed. Archaeology, too, bears witness. The strata at Shuruppak and your show distinct layers of river silt, followed by entirely new kinds of settlement, simpler, more practical, built by hands that no longer remembered how to summon heaven. Tools change, writing changes, even art becomes less cosmic, more human. The long age of divine geometry gives way to the age of survival, and yet the memory of the flood endures in every culture as both wound and warning. In Mesopotamia, it is a divine reset. In Egypt, it becomes the inundation of the Nile, life-giving rather than deadly. In India, Manu survives a deluge guided by a fish who is also a god. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth by casting stones that turn into men and women. Everywhere, the same pattern: destruction, survival, renewal. The flood is less a singular event than an archetype, a story humanity tells itself whenever the world feels too heavy with sin or noise. Why does it persist? Perhaps because somewhere in our collective memory, we still remember standing at the edge of extinction. The flood is the trauma of the species, compressed into myth. It is the moment we first understood fragility, that civilizations, no matter how divine, can drown. But beneath that terror lies something gentler. The flood is also a birth. From its waters, the world is washed clean, and humanity begins to build again. The first plow cuts through the soft mud of a new earth. Seeds are planted. Children are born who will never know the long shadows of immortal kings. In their eyes, the sky is vast and empty, but also full of possibility. The Sumerians did not treat the flood as an end. They treated it as calibration. The old cycles, 12 sars of divine rule, the great rhythms of the heavens were reset. The gods, it seemed, had adjusted the clock of creation. What once spanned millennia now fit into the breath of a human life. In Genesis, this idea becomes law. My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Time shortened, life limited, history begun. You can imagine the survivors standing on the new soil, the sun rising weakly over the still damp earth. They do not yet have writing to record the moment, so they carve it into memory instead. The flood becomes their measure, their dividing line. Before the flood is the realm of gods. After it, the age of men. Every myth born afterward, of Babel, of Egypt, of Uruk rose from that soil, watered by the memory of the deluge. In the King List, this transition is abrupt yet elegant. One sentence ends an age, and another begins. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended again from heaven. The descent continues but changed. The kings who follow are mortal. Their authority is a shadow of the old radiance. They rule not as embodiments of the divine, but as its delegates, interpreting what remains of heaven's rhythm. You sense, as you read the clay, that the scribes themselves understood the enormity of what they were preserving. The flood is not just an event in history, it's the architecture of time. The Sumerians built their sense of order around its repetition. The flood that was, the flood that will be. For them, the world did not end once. It ends in cycles, again and again, whenever the balance between heaven and earth fractures. Perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, the same fear lingers. The sea level rises, storms intensify, cities drown. We speak of climate, not gods, but the pattern is the same. The flood remains our oldest prophecy, written not only in clay but in memory, in the genes that remember the sound of rain on the roof of an ark. And yet, the story's power lies in its gentleness. After the destruction comes the covenant. After the silence, the seed. The flood is not a punishment. It is a rhythm. It teaches that every civilization, no matter how bright, must one day return to clay and from that clay, begin again. The tablet, though silent, whispers this truth between its lines. Time will always be a tide. What was once above will fall. What was lost will surface. And in the space between drowning and rebirth, the world remembers how to breathe. When the waters recede, the King List resumes its chant. The names that follow are shorter, human, their reigns counted not in SARS but in years. And among them stands one figure, tall enough to cast a shadow across both worlds, the divine and the mortal. In Uruk, Gilgamesh ruled for 126 years, only a fraction of the ages before him. Yet his name endures when the long-lived kings have turned to dust. You picture him standing on the walls of Uruk, his city shining under the desert sun. He is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, an equation of longing. His strength is legend, but so is his grief. Where Ululam ruled in eternity, Gilgamesh wrestles with impermanence. Where Enmendarana ascended to heaven, Gilgamesh seeks it and fails. And in that failure, he becomes something greater than any of the kings before him, the mirror in which humanity first saw itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved in the same wedge-shaped script as the King List begins. Where the old world ended, the flood has passed, the gods are distant. The hero walks the ruins of what was divine and asks the first truly human question: must I die too? His quest for immortality is not rebellion, it is remembrance. He seeks the secret of the old age, the age when kingship still burned with heavenly fire. He finds Utnapishtim, survivor of the flood, the last echo of the ancient line, and begs for the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim tells him what no human wants to hear: there is no permanence. The gods decreed mortality after the flood. The descent of kingship continues, but its nature has changed forever. The light that once descended from heaven now burns only within a spark in the clay of the human heart. In the story's rhythm, you can feel the King List beating beneath it. The long-lived rulers become myth, the flood becomes boundary, and Gilgamesh becomes bridge. He is the hinge between eternity and time. The clay that records his name is the same clay that once carried the names of gods. But where those tablets measured lifespans, his measure emotion loss, friendship, longing, fear. Archaeologists have unearthed the city he built. Uruk's walls still rise from the earth, stretching for miles. Temples of Inanna, goddess of love and war, still hold inscriptions in his name. The dust of his streets carries both history and myth. Here, the divine past becomes tangible, the bricks of the old world shaped by human hands. In the epic, Gilgamesh meets Enkidu, his equal and opposite, wild man and king, nature and civilization. Their friendship binds heaven and earth for a brief moment. But when Enkidu dies, the illusion shatters. The king who conquered giants and gods cannot conquer time. His cryra, unpoetic, desperate, marks the dawn of human self-awareness. Shall I not die like Enkidu? Sorrow has entered my heart. The Anunnaki, the old gods, reappear briefly in the story, not as teachers, but as judges. They are distant now, presiding from shadows. Their presence feels more like memory than fact, their power diluted by distance. Yet Gilgamesh still bears traces of them in his veins, the last spark of their longevity flickering in mortal flesh. He is the son of the old world and the father of the new. Through him, the age of myth becomes the age of men. In his final act, Gilgamesh fails to claim immortality. The flower of life slips from his grasp, stolen by a serpent. Yet this loss transforms him. He returns to Uruk, weary but wiser, and looks upon the walls his hands have built. This too is my immortality, he seems to whisper. The divine legacy, once measured in the span of Sars, now lives in memory, in creation, in story. Time no longer bends for kings, but it remembers them. The King List and the epic meet here, in his figure. Both are made of clay. Both attempt to rescue meaning from oblivion. One lists years that defy belief. The other tells a story that defines humanity. Together, they form the axis of all later civilization, the belief that the past was greater, that something sacred once walked among us, and that its echo still lingers in our bones. From a modern eye, Gilgamesh is the first true historical myth, the first record of consciousness confronting mortality. But for the ancients, he was proof that the divine lineage still breathed in human form. He stood halfway between the Anunnaki and the clay from which humans were molded. His failure was not punishment, it was transition. The age of kings who lived for 36,000 years was over. The age of kings who remembered began. As you imagine him on the walls of Uruk, the desert wind sweeping his hair, the scene feels almost familiar. He stares at the horizon, where the land meets the sky, where the gods once descended. He knows they will not return, but he keeps watch anyway. In his silence, you can hear every civilization that followed the builders of Egypt, the philosophers of Greece, the prophets of Israel, still searching for that same lost threshold between heaven and earth. Gilgamesh never found immortality, yet his name endures beyond them all. He is proof that memory, not eternity, is the true defiance of death. And in his story, the King List finds its resolution. The descent of kingship from heaven becomes the ascent of humanity toward understanding. The flood erased the old world, but through him, its shadow remains. When you read his name on the tablet, the letters pressed deep by hands 4,000 years gone, you realize that the descent never truly ended, simply changed direction. Heaven fell into clay, and from clay it began to rise again. After Gilgamesh, the King List continues, its tone subdued, almost weary. The names multiply, their reigns shorten, the divine syllables fading into human consonants. Once, kings ruled for 43,000 years. Now, they rule for 40. The air of eternity has left the page. And yet, between these mortal years, something lingers, the faint pulse of the old blood, the echo of the Anunnaki. Scholars see in this transition a strange arithmetic. Before the flood, kings lived in units of the Sa 3,600 years, the perfect cycle of heaven. After the flood, those cycles collapse into human decades. The pattern is too deliberate to be accident. The scribes were not merely listing rulers. They were recording a cosmic contraction, the compression of divinity into flesh. Imagine the generations after Gilgamesh. They tell stories by firelight of kings who once never died, of rulers who ascended to the stars. They no longer remember the names Clerali Lulam, Alalga, Enmanluana, but they remember the feeling that once to rule was to shine. Now their kings bleed, they grow old, they die. Yet in the blood that darkens the soil, something divine remains, invisible but unforgotten. The idea of divine descent does not vanish, it evolves. In Egypt, Pharaoh is the son of Ra, ruling by light. In China, emperors carry the mandate of heaven. In Israel, kings are anointed with oil to signify God's choice. The vocabulary changes, but the core belief endures. Kingship descends. Authority is not earned from below, it flows from above. The old Sumerian conviction survives, scattered like fragments of the same broken tablet across the earth. But what, exactly, descended? The Anunnaki tradition offers one answer. Zechariah Sitchin, controversial. Defiant suggested that the descent was literal, beings of flesh and blood from another world, the architects of human life. If his theory is even metaphorically true, then what the King List records is not legend but lineage, the record of a hybrid bloodline bridging heaven and earth. When the flood swept away the old order, the divine genome diluted, but it did not vanish. It survived in whispers, in anomalies, in the idea that rulers carried something different in their veins. You look again at the phrase blue blood, a term still used for royalty. It seems poetic now, but some researchers trace it to ancient symbology. In Mesopotamia, copper and the blood of gods were linked to the shining fluid that never rusted, that reflected the sky. To say one had blue blood was to remember that the first kings were not quite like the rest. Myths of the divine right of kings, the sons of heaven, even the angels of Genesis who took daughters of men, all repeat the same pattern: mingling, descent, dilution. Over centuries, the divine strain grows thinner, yet its memory shapes civilizations. Dynasties rise and fall, claiming heavenly ancestry. Sumer gives it to Akkad, Akkad to Babylon, Babylon to Persia, then to Rome. Each empire inherits the language of descent, though the stars above grow silent. The Anunnaki vanish into legend, yet their hierarchy remains, fossilized into human institutions. Thrones replace thrones, crowns replace halos. Kingship survives as ritual, stripped of light but heavy with meaning. The King List becomes both scripture and skeleton. Beneath its simple recitation of names lies the oldest philosophical question: what makes one fit to rule? The Sumerians answered, proximity to heaven. The modern world answers, power, wealth, will. Between these two answers lies the long decay of divinity, the slow evaporation of heaven's breath from human history. But perhaps that loss was necessary. The flood had wiped away the gods, not in vengeance, but in mercy, returning the world to mortal hands. For the first time, humanity was free to define itself, free and terrified. Without the gods' direct rule, humans sought to recreate divine order through symbols, temples, laws, calendars, to imitate the heavens, not to live within them. Civilization itself, the act of writing, of measuring time, of building walls, was an attempt to reconstruct the divine pattern from memory. You can still feel this yearning in every sacred geometry, every golden ratio, every cathedral ceiling that stretches toward the light. We build what we no longer remember, guided by an ache deeper than reason. The descent of kingship ended, but its echo became architecture, mathematics, myth. The divine blood withdrew into abstraction, hiding within our imaginations, our dreams of perfection. Yet, the King List reminds us of something uncomfortable, that what we call human progress may also be divine amnesia. Once, kingship was measured by harmony with heaven. Now, it is measured by the reach of empires. The arc of history bends away from the sky. The long reigns of Ululam and Alalga become fairy tales, their names reduced to syllables in museums. But the numbers remain the SARS, the precision, and, in those numbers, something still hums. Perhaps this is what the scribes intended. Not a literal record, but a cipher. A map of descent, charting not time but transformation. From divine to human, from eternity to moment, from ruler to seeker. In this view, the King List is less history than anatomy, the body of civilization laid bare. The bloodline of the gods, thinned but unbroken, flows not in kings now, but in curiosity itself, the human drive to look upward and remember. You feel it when you read the tablets, when you gaze at the stars, when you whisper the names of the first kings. The descent never truly ended. It merely changed its vessel. The throne moved inward into the mind, and perhaps that is the true legacy of the Anunnaki, not dominion, but consciousness. The spark they left within us, the ability to ask, where did we come from? Is there immortality? In that question, their blood still flows. When modern scholars first read the King List, they called it myth, but others restless. Heretical saw more than poetry in the numbers. 241,200 years before the flood. Kingship descending from heaven. 10 rulers who reigned before the waters came. What if these were not allegories, but records? What if the descent from heaven was literal? In the 20th century, Zecharia Sitchin read the same tablets that others filed under mythology and heard a different voice. He saw the word Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, and believed it was no metaphor. To him, the Sumerians had not imagined gods, they had remembered visitors. The prism of Weld-Blundell was not fantasy, but genealogy. The list of antediluvian kings was not symbolic, but dynastic descendants of celestial beings who once ruled the earth. You can dismiss it easily, or you can pause and notice the precision of the ancient record. The reigns multiply by 3,600. The Sar Sitchin saw in that number an orbit 3,600 years, the period of a lost planet called Nibiru, moving in an elongated path around the sun. Every time it approached, its inhabitants, the Anunnaki, returned. They taught, they ruled, they shaped. Then they left, leaving humanity to evolve in their shadow. Under this lens, the flood was no divine punishment, was celestial collateral. The result of gravitational chaos when Nibiru's path disturbed the Earth's stability. The descent of kingship becomes contact, the return to heaven becomes departure. The myths of Eridu, Bad Tibira, and Sippa become a chronicle of errors when the gods walked among Meneras, that ended when heaven moved beyond reach. Is it true? No one can prove it, but that is not the point. The power of such a theory lies not in its certainty but in its resonance. The Sumerians themselves insisted that knowledge came from above. Their first city, Eridu, was founded not by farmers or hunters, but by those who descended. Their first king, Ululam, was chosen not by birth, but by descent. In the earliest hymns, the gods are described not as spirits, but as physical beings bright, immense, commanding, who measured the earth and raised the seed of life. Archaeology reveals strange corroborations. The sudden leap of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE with writing, mathematics, astronomy, irrigation, and law emerging almost simultaneously feels less like evolution and more like ignition. The people of Uruk wrote about the planets with accuracy that seems impossible for their tools. They described Uranus and Neptune long before telescopes existed. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, cycles of 25,920 years. To modern eyes, this knowledge appears borrowed from where no one knows. In this view, the flood becomes an event of cleansing, both geological and genetic. The Anunnaki, seeing humanity grown unruly, allowed the world to reset. Yet they spared a few Zeusodra traces. Noah, because some fragment of their own creation deserved to endure. The survivors carried memory, technology, language. After the waters, kingship descended again, but weaker, mortal. The divine genome diluted, but not extinguished. You can feel how this story pulls at the imagination. It does not demand belief, it invites wonder. It reframes human history not as accident, but as inheritance. We are not merely descendants of apes, it whispers, but apprentices of gods. Each civilization, from Sumer to Egypt to the Maya, carries the same fingerprints, pyramids aligned with the stars, calendars attuned to celestial mechanics, myths of beings who came from above and promised to return. In this reading, the King List becomes the oldest scientific document, an encoded log of celestial visits. The enormous rains, once dismissed as mythic exaggeration, could represent cycles between arrivals. Ululam's 28,800 years might mark 8 orbits of Nibiru. Alalga's 36,000 years, 10. The flood then, a realignment, a cosmic interval when the sky itself shifted, washing away the age of gods. And yet, beneath all speculation, something quieter calls for attention. Whether or not the Anunnaki walked the earth, the myth reflects a truth deeper than fact. The human conviction that wisdom descends. The idea that order, knowledge, and art are not invented, but received. Every era of enlightenment, from the Sumerians to the Renaissance, has described its own awakening as revelation, as light falling upon the world. Perhaps the heaven from which kingship descended was not a planet, but consciousness itself, awakening of mind within matter. Sitchin's theory, ridiculed by many, endures because it restores awe to history. It re-enchants the clay. It reminds us that ancient people did not see gods in the sky because they were primitive. They saw divinity because the world still shimmered with mystery. Their mathematics was worship. Their astronomy was devotion. Their history was theology. And maybe that is the true descent, the arrival of awareness so luminous that we mistook it for visitors. The Anunnaki may have been gods or beings, but they may also have been symbols of something far greater. The moment when humanity first looked up and realized that the stars were not random, that they moved in harmony, that meaning itself was written in their motion. So the prism remains, turning slowly beneath the museum light. Scholars read it as history. Dreamers read it as prophecy. Its 4 faces hold both versions. On one side, the record of kings. On the other, the echo of heaven. Between them, a question as old as time. Did the gods make us, or did we make them to remember what we once were? The King List ends where it began, with silence. Its final lines fade into the dust of history, the neat columns of cuneiform tapering off as though the scribe himself knew that no record could hold what comes next. The descent of kingship, the flood, the brief flicker of divine rule all dissolve into the unmeasured centuries that followed. And yet, the rhythm persists. The pattern hums beneath the world's surface, waiting for the next descent. You imagine the tablet resting in its case, a sliver of clay older than every written language that followed. It lies there like a heart still faintly beating, each line a pulse from a world that refused to die. When you read it, you can feel something ancient stir behind your eyes. Not belief, exactly, but memory. A memory of order, of descent, of sky once closer than it is now. The Sumerians believed that history was cyclical, that every age ends where another begins. The flood was not the first, nor the last. It was one tide among many. The gods descend, the world blooms, the gods depart, the waters rise. Over and over, civilization is not a line. It is a breath. Expansion and collapse, revelation and forgetting. The prism, with its strange arithmetic of stars, is not a timeline but a rhythm, a cosmic heartbeat. Modern science, in its own language, agrees. Civilizations rise and fall in cycles of environment and entropy. Ice ages come and go. Magnetic fields shift. Stars pulse. Galaxies inhale and exhale. Even the orbit of our planet wobbles in long intervals, shaping climates and tides. The ancients may not have known the terms, but they knew the feeling, the pulse beneath everything. Perhaps that is what the descent of kingship truly meant, not beings falling from the sky, but consciousness itself awakening in cycles. Each descent brings a spark, a moment when humanity remembers something of its origin, builds again, learns again, and then forgets. The flood, the fall, the dark ages, the Renaissance, they are all reflections of one endless wave, rising and falling between heaven and earth. You can trace that wave through time. After Sumer, Egypt rises, its pharaohs calling themselves sons of Ra. After Egypt, Greece dreams of Olympus. After Greece, Rome crowns emperors as divine. After Rome, the heavens recede into silence, and yet men still reach for them through cathedrals, through telescopes, through rockets. Every ascent we build begins as memory of a descent. And here we are again, in another age that has forgotten and is beginning to remember. We map genomes and name comets. We scan the sky for radio whispers, searching for voices that might once have been ours. We dig through ruins, reassemble shattered tablets, trace the arc of stories across millennia. We no longer build ziggurats, but we launch satellites, new towers, this time of light and orbit. Kingship has changed form again. No longer divine right, but knowledge itself, descending from the heavens as data, as code, as revelation through science. The ancients might have called this the new descent, the return of order from the stars. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the gods never left. They simply changed their language. Their tablets became equations. Their hymns became signals. The same pattern translated across epochs. But even in this age of circuitry and mathematics, the old truths remain. Every civilization that forgets its source begins to drown, sometimes in water, sometimes in noise. Our floods are not always of rivers. They are of memory, of distraction, of hubris. And somewhere within them, a quiet voice repeats the same line that once closed the prism, then the flood swept over. The line is not a warning of doom, it is an instruction. The flood is the reset that allows remembrance. It clears the ground for kingship to descend again, in whatever form the next awakening requires. It reminds us that destruction is not the opposite of creation, but its preparation. And so the King List, for all its ancient dust, becomes a living prophecy. It tells us that time is not our enemy, that every fall carries within it the seed of ascent. It tells us that we are not separate from the divine story, we are its continuation, its clay tablets still being written. The descent of kingship was not a single event lost to prehistory. It is the perpetual motion of meaning entering matter. Every idea, every act of compassion, every moment of awe is another descent. The prism, the flood, the kings, they were never only history. They were metaphors for the great rhythm that sustains existence. Heaven falling into earth, earth rising toward heaven. The eternal exchange, the descent and the ascent, the clay and the light. When you step back from the glass case that holds the Weld-Blundell Prism, your reflection merges with it. The faint cuneiform signs seem to shimmer against your own face. You realize that the story has never ended. The kings are gone, but their purpose remains, to hold the line between chaos and order, to remember the descent. You leave the museum, and outside, the sky is bruised with evening light. The first stars appear, ancient and unblinking. Somewhere above them, perhaps, the orbit of Nibiru still moves through its long, silent path. Or perhaps the orbit is within USA's cycle of awakening, waiting to return. The flood will come again. It always does. But so will the descent. Kingship will fall once more from heaven, not as rulers, but as understanding. And when it does, the clay of our world will remember how to glow. For now, the prism waits, quiet, eternal, and the flood will sweep over, and heaven will descend again.